Right. Okay, are we recording? Yes, we're recording. Okay, hello everyone, some new faces. Welcome to the Free Speech Society. I am the president and your host, Juno. And today we're very happy to welcome Vlad Vexler. Sorry, I'm really nervous. I'm a big fan. Yeah, Vlad, could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. I am writing a book about political philosophy. My background is in that. But I'm also developing this kind of experiment of communicating with the culture. I've been doing that with some intensity over the last few months. And I've conducted a range of conversations online in my capacity as a political philosopher, but preponderantly with an eye on the Russo-Ukrainian war. And that's the beginning of a conversation I hope to have for many years with the culture about how we make sense of the politics around us.
Right. So how this event is going to go is we'll have about, I think we'll have about an hour or so of talk, and then we will move on to audience questions. So to make a start, I think we would like to begin with, there's this question that gained a lot of discussion even before the event. So once we announced the title of the event on Facebook, it is Putin's War and the Philosophy of Tyranny, we immediately received a lot of comments that either thanked us for calling it Putin's War instead of Russia's war, or criticized that we should have called it Russia's war because ultimately you can't fight a war without the ordinary men on the war front. So Vlad, if there is a moral answer to this question, whose war is it?
I'd love to answer that question. I just want to ask you something technical quickly. I'm struggling to get your sound onto my headphones. So you're coming through my computer and I'm worried this is going to rebound for you in the recording.
It sounds fine as of now, so I guess...
If it sounds okay, we can just survive it like this. Okay, good.
Yes.
I don't think that that's a question you want to answer in 30 seconds flat.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that when we think about what kind of things we are responsible for, that's always a conversation about a very complex economy of ethical sentiment, starting from something like direct blame, which we will certainly attribute to everybody in the Putin regime, to being ethically implicated and being ethically responsible. And if we just talk about moral responsibility, then even Russians who are vehemently against the war are responsible for it ethically. Even Alexei Navalny, who is in jail and is being tortured by the Putin regime, is in part responsible for this war as a Russian citizen. And he feels that, and that's why, indeed, partly at least, why he's in jail. But if we take it away from this ethical sense of your question, and we ask ourselves, where do the Russian people stand in relation to this war? That's a really difficult question to answer because you can really only answer it about two segments of the demographics in Russia. You can answer it about the people who are clearly against the war, and that's around 20% or less. And you can answer it about people who are clearly in favor of the war, and that's a similar number, about 20% or less. But the majority of the Russian people are in the middle, and they are extraordinarily depoliticized. They have lived themselves into a kind of arrangement whereby they outsource politics to the Kremlin and hope, with fingers and toes and everything else crossed, that that's going to work out very well for them. And it hasn't. And that's such an extraordinary catastrophe that this sort of outsourcing of politics has landed them into, that is what's really the hardest thing for them to face, not the recognition of what's truly happening in Ukraine, what their regime is doing in Ukraine, but actually that their arrangement with politics has ended in disaster. That is the key obstacle and the key source of millions of Russians wanting to avert their gaze and not face what's happening. And so the answer to your question is, a minority on either side has a kind of expressed voice, but half of the population, if not more, are in this depoliticized state whereby we can't say they're either in favor or against the war.
Right, yeah, so yeah, I do remember you have said on your channel quite a few times that the majority of Russian people are absolutely apathetic about politics when it is not coming for them. But now that the now that the partial mobilization in quotation marks are happening, people, I think a lot of people do see it coming from them, right? Especially young men. So like, has that kind of changed how people view politics?
I think what you're looking for optimistically is a situation where they're coming for us, is a situation where us is taken to be all Russian citizens. That's not how people have experienced this. And indeed, even the protests against mobilization that we've witnessed were local in the claims that were being made. They weren't fundamentally aimed against the Putin regime, and they weren't meant to represent all Russian citizens. They were really about the challenge that there's the kind of indirectly genocidal aspect to Putin's mobilization, and disadvantaged folks and ethnic minorities have been at the receiving end of this mobilization. That's led a lot of people to feel great resentment. But what is missing is some sense of civic mobilization here that is based on the perception that I am a Russian citizen, and as a Russian citizen, I want to reject this regime. That is missing. And because the social sciences aren't really sciences, and because there is something really obscure about authoritarian regimes, we don't know exactly what's going on. It's hard for us to say at what point there's going to be a kind of a limit whereby millions of Russians will say, no, 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 this is too much. What the regime has learned, I'm afraid, over the last few months is that they're not close to that limit. And I'm myself very pessimistically of the view that the regime could take 5x the casualties they've taken now, while still broadly retaining a relatively calm scenario in relation to protest at home.
Right, so do you think that the reason why protests aren't happening right now is because of a sense of individualism? It's because, you know, people are only considering themselves, or is there some other challenge?
I think the main challenge is kind of obvious, and that's that if you come out to protest, you'll be arrested, beaten up, possibly tortured, and you'll lose your career, and people in your life might also lose their careers or have their bank accounts frozen. Now, is that as bad as the 1930s under Stalin? No. Is that bad enough to make a person think 17 times before taking any action? Yes, it is. And if you couple that with the perception that most Russians who really don't like what's happening have, that even if they did come out in significant numbers, it wouldn't make a difference at the moment, then you're inevitably going to get the kind of result you're getting now. But we've got to be careful, because even though it's true that it's really difficult to bottom up overthrow a fairly stable authoritarian regime, this is not the Ukrainian Maidan of 2014, where the protesters had half of the political system already on their side. This is not even Belarus in 2020, when the regime was genuinely fragile. It's a regime with a good degree of vertical control still, the Kremlin. And so challenging it bottom up is a really difficult enterprise. Having said this, we've got to admit that the efficacy of protest isn't some kind of matter of a fact of nature. How efficacious protest is in part dependent on how efficacious people think it is. So we don't want to consolidate what I've just said in stone and say that you cannot move the Putin regime at the moment. But because it's an authoritarian regime that is really still in really good control over the situation, and because there is this perception that we're going to be coming out fruitlessly, you're ending up in this situation where there's virtually no protest at all. And the only way this will shift is if the regime wobbles quite a lot more and people begin to feel that protesting could make a difference. I do believe that if enough Russians felt that protesting would make a difference, they would actually take more risks, and they'd risk their lives too. So it's a complex picture. We don't want to say that protest is simply fruitless and undoable now, but we do want to acknowledge the quite understandable obstacles that you would face if you wanted to strategize from within Russia to bring out hundreds of thousands of people onto the street. That'd be, at the moment, we don't want to say anything is undoable, but that would be virtually undoable today.
Sorry, 1 second, it's the volume. Right, yeah, so when you are talking about the desperate situation for protesters in Russia, I can see a complete parallel of how it is in China. And like it is, it is a country with a dictator that not only no one dared to stop, but no one had the idea to stop because, well, the general public don't really know what being political it's like, and if anything, the general public think that being political is a negative thing. So the general public lower their bottom lines again and again, while the politicized, pro-democratic people can't really do too much. But also, it was the end of last year, wasn't it? When the zero COVID policy in China was at its worst, like there were large-scale political protests broke out the first time in like more than 3 decades. Like, I'm not going to talk about the aftermath. It did not end very well, and most of these people are being harassed, and there were collective punishment, whatnot, like everything that you just said about Russia, that also applies to China. But also, it's like that is one move that had the effect of the zero COVID policy being taken down, and it just gave everyone a sense of optimism. So do you think that even if the Russian public is not capable of big changes like overthrowing the government, are there, smaller changes that could happen that will tell people protesting works?
The problem we've got is that the issue of the war is so all-encompassing, and that the regime has married the issue. In other words, Putin is committed to engaging in a war against the West, of which Ukraine is just one frontier, until the regime collapses, or so long as the regime exists. So protesting against the war in Russia really would mean protesting against the Putin regime. It's not like coming out against a pension policy or a COVID management policy. That makes it really, really difficult. Having said this, I do think there are differences between Russia and China. I think that there's more freedom of speech in Russia today than there is in China. And the authoritarianism in China is realer, whereas the authoritarianism in Russia is more imitative. In other words, if 10 people do something that is utterly unacceptable to the state, the odds are much higher in China that they're all going to be picked up. Whereas the policy of the Putin regime will be to pick out 2 and do something really terrible with them, but let the 8 go. So there is a kind of imitative quality still to this Putinite political system. And that still means that it's possible to indirectly criticize the government while living in Russia, as long as you don't go too far and as long as you don't talk too explicitly about the war. And you can still get away with broadcasting to a big YouTube audience from Russia and have an anti-regime message. But it will be limited. There will be certain things that you just can't say. You can't call the war a war regularly and confidently keep on getting away with it. So there are differences. And one of the interesting things is that the Russian state will be moving in some ways toward China, but in other ways toward a kind of more disorganized and chaotic and almost anarchic kind of tyranny, whereby it's not clear where the centers of authority are. That's also a very big risk for Russia. But the basic challenge is, I think, what I've just put on the table earlier, that most people feel that protesting isn't going to work now. These are the people who are opposed to the regime. And then the depoliticized majority have simply not yet woken up from their depoliticized state, and they retain a hope that they can sort of walk a tightrope here and get away with without being implicated in this whole drama. I believe they're going to be disappointed, but at the moment, that's where we are. So I think that protests in Russia are likely and inevitable down the line, but I'm not going to be predicting that that's going to happen next month.
Right. So I just want to pick up on when you said that the regime has married itself to the war. Since when has that happened, and what are the ideas behind it?
I think there are 2 ideas. The first is about regime security. If you listen to almost all Russian experts, the really good ones seem to just converge on this view that at least a large portion of the justification for this war in Putin's mind is to do with consolidating his stay in power. That was the original intent, at least. And that was indeed the intent in 2014 when he got involved in Ukraine and annexed Crimea. So if you want a kind of a cartoonish image of this, the image is that there will be a time when the Putin regime wobbles, and the last thing he wants when that happens is an independent democratic Ukraine on Russia's borders. And that's really all it is. A democratic and independent Ukraine, even without being a member of any Western alliances, is an unacceptable existential threat to Putin. And he would say an existential threat even to his physical existence, and an existential threat to Russian civilization. Speaking of Russian civilization, there is this other story that's not just a story about regime security. And that perhaps starts around 2012. I think different commentators dated to a different point in time, but we're talking about 2010 to 2014, roughly, when Putin took a kind of civilizational turn. He began getting obsessed with modeling himself on past Russian rulers, and really came to think that he had a sense of mission, which is an extraordinary thing, because this is a kind of a quasi-mafia-like regime, suddenly, as it were, entering the priesthood, or at least engaging in various kinds of quasi-mystical types of thinking. And I think that that really happened, and it's got worse since, and it's got worse for Putin during COVID isolation. So he really thinks that he is in some way the incarnation of the collective destiny of the Russian people, and that somehow all of this stuff about what kind of a country Russia is, and whether it's in Europe or whether it's in Asia, and whether it should be a democracy or not, and what kind of contribution it should make to world affairs, that all of that somehow rests on Putin's shoulders in a way that completely transcends the contingencies of how humans get to power. He thinks he's sort of born into this role now to a good extent. And that's profoundly dangerous. And that explains some of the intransigence of his commitment to this project, even when in many ways it's now looking like it's destabilizing his regime. So Putin thinks that in the end, he has still got a chance of realizing this sort of civilizational mission. A practical implication of it, one of the practical implications, is that Russia has to reestablish itself as a global actor of great significance at the expense of the current level of power that Western nations have. And Putin wants dissolved NATO. He wants a good amount of control over all of Eastern Europe. And now, when he's struggling to even progress a few extra miles in southeastern Ukraine, he still thinks that's possible. And he thinks that's possible because there's a kind of a new dogma in the Kremlin that the West is in irreversible decline, and that even if there is really good consolidation right now and reasonable support for Ukraine, that eventually that will fracture and he'll be able to assert his civilizational mission. And that is concocted of a kind of very ill-assorted salad of ideas. And you can sometimes ask about ideas, whether they're wrong or whether they're not even wrong, they're incoherent. And I would argue that the stuff that Putin has assembled doesn't really even make much sense. But they are ideas about Russia's historical destiny and Russia's extraordinary mission of, as it were, starting the race right at the back, but then overtaking nations that have been ahead of it with a great rapid leap. So one story is regime security, but there is another story that is a civilizational mission. And that is, I think, more important than sort of dry geopolitical interests to do with obstructing NATO expansion or with gaining certain resources. So there is the story about an escalation against the West, partly propped up by mystical thinking, and then there's a story about regime security.
Right. So with the latter part about maintaining so-called Russian, certain like so-called the Russian spirit against the West, is that something that Putin or the Kremlin had since the beginning, or is that some sort of propaganda that kind of they convinced themselves into?
I think that's actually a really good question, because one of the things that can happen in authoritarian regimes is that made-up propaganda becomes convincing to the people who know it's made up and who originally made it up. And there is quite a bit of that going on in this regime. I think that, however, with Putin, there are elements of sincerity there, and he really began to think in these civilizational terms, I think, around the time he came back to replace Medvedev when they did this sort of swap. And so when he's back in 2012, he's already beginning to compare himself to Tsar Alexander III and various other historical figures, and think about how he is made to transform Russia's role in global history and return Russia to something, to some kind of glory. But often these pictures of past glory are themselves illusions. And so there isn't even anything coherent that they're returning to. At the moment, there's a big focus on the Second World War. The regime is trying to persuade at least some citizens that there is some kind of a spiritual continuity. Russia's am I still audible?
You're cutting out a bit.
So sorry, how is it now?
Yeah, it's all right. It seems all right now.
Okay, sorry about that.
Like 30 seconds ago.
In 2012, Putin began to think along these lines, and he did it with some sincerity and naivety. But there were also other people who kind of thought this was all BS, but have come to half believe in it now. Because we often ask ourselves, does that person believe it because they really believe it, or do they believe it sincerely, or do they believe it because it serves them? And I think the answer is they believe it sincerely because it serves them. And that's very often a reasonable way of putting it. And I think that there's been a period of about 10 years when we've been able to observe this kind of turn, and therefore it's possible to say that there were signs of something like this conflict as a possible outcome for quite a few years now.
Right. So yeah, so one thing I thought of, like just moving it from Russia to the world, should we be more scared about Putin, or should we be more scared about people in our democracies, for example, people like Donald Trump, who seems to also be engaged in this sort of self-deceiving, self-fulfilling thinking?
I think that we've got to be very careful about Russian interference and Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation in Western democracies. But we've also got to recognize that our problems are fundamentally local, that there is a limit to how far Russian interference could capsize our democracies. And if you look at the pattern of, let's say, online Russian campaigns, they very rarely try to invent conflicts and then persuade us into them. They typically pick on conflicts that already divide us in the West and try to make those worse. So the key thing here is to not underestimate the impact of Russian interference in Western democracies, but also to acknowledge that our challenges are local and they're not just a product of malign foreign interference. I do think that there is a crisis of trust in political institutions in Western countries now, and that trust is local. That trust issue is local. The trust crisis is local. One of the institutions that's experiencing a crisis of trust is the academy and the universities. And connectedly, expertise, the very idea of expertise, is sort of in crisis in our societies. And so we've got to be very honest about this and not accuse each other of being Russian shills or Russian agents, because that will make us close to the pathologies going on in our democracies. And if we are going to close ourselves to that, we're not going to see various kinds of pitfalls and abysses ahead of us as we traverse them. I think that many citizens now feel powerless. Many citizens now feel lost, and many citizens now feel betrayed. And they feel all of that, not just towards some political agents, but toward the entirety of their political systems. And that is a problem that's been building up for quite a while. And it's a problem that is really, really important to address sociologically and psychologically, and not just with simple-minded sort of epistemic approaches which just focus on disinformation. Underneath disinformation, underneath the problem of citizens falling for disinformation, there's a crisis of trust. And we've got to speak to that rather than going around telling citizens that they're foolish or they've fallen for this bit of manipulation that partly comes from overseas. So we've got to acknowledge that democracies, like people, can get sick and that they need to go to the doctor and they need to go for a rest. And they need to acknowledge when they're going through crises and not just blame all of that on other people around them.
Yeah, so on the point when you said issues are local issues, sorry, I was just laughing just a bit because you see there is a rise in conspiracy theories in the West where people start suspecting whenever there's a problem that, you know, for example, both sides of American politics are actors, like are puppets that controlled by Russia. And there are even some conspiracy theories suggesting, you know, Zelensky is merely a puppet. In fact, we have someone, as we're speaking right now, we have one of these people in our room. So what would you like to say to this sort of people?
I don't want to say you're wrong or you're foolish, because it's very important that that's not a conversation about Zelensky. If you think that Zelensky is some kind of a puppet, your problem isn't with understanding Zelensky. Your problem is with understanding the difference between illusion and reality. If somebody tells me that they don't think that, I don't know, pain is real, I'm not going to argue with them about pain and get out some pins and needles and make comparisons. I'm going to say, hang on, something else has gone wrong. But I'm also not going to say that that's a stupid thing to think, because the source of that kind of thought will very often be a loss of faith in the political process, a loss of the sense that it makes sense, a loss of the sense that it's intelligible. And it's very important to say, okay, if somebody's feeling that, and intelligent people can feel that, then that's where we have to start. We have to deal in people's real feelings, not in the feelings we would like them to have. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say by extension is that if somebody feels that Zelensky is just a puppet of some kind of forces that may not even be visible, that person is a fellow citizen. And if they're a citizen of my country, I'm a British citizen, then I'm going to share my polity and my public square with them, because neither they nor I can make each other disappear from the table of politics. The table of politics is not a place where we fall in love with how much we're all agreeing with each other. The table of politics is a place where you eat shit and deal with the fact that as long as somebody is not explicitly threatening violence, you've probably got to keep talking together and seeing what happens. And that leads to perhaps the third bit of the answer. And that's that if you've got somebody who supports Ukraine, wants more Western military and other kinds of support to be extended to Ukraine, and you've got somebody who thinks that this is the working out of some kind of hidden plan, and Ukraine is not really a meaningful agent in this situation, then the best thing to do is, if these people live together vaguely, they live in the same part of town, they should keep connected and they should keep talking. And they should also keep connected around issues that are less political, where they might agree, particularly local issues. What you'll often find is somebody who has a view that to the other person seems altogether mad, and vice versa, that these two people are going to be able to agree on building a road locally, on changing the local speed limit, on what should happen with the park locally. So there are always going to be mechanisms of engagement that are going to be constructive when you're dealing with citizens who have such a different view of their political reality that it seems that they can't share anything at all. Bottom line is, we're going to have to keep sharing, and we're going to have to agree that we're all citizens. There isn't a magic sort of escape hatch. you can get into and sort of get away from the political reality around you. I suppose you can emigrate, but you might face the same problems wherever you go. Or you could start a secession movement. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be in Bristol and say Bristol should be an independent country now, because here more people agree with me. And we're going to secede, and we're going to forget about all these other people we don't like. We're stuck. So you have to keep talking. And I think it's morally disgraceful to too readily call fellow voters just dumb and stupid and foolish. So we've got to be serious about not just screaming disinformation when we come across something that seems to us to be factually questionable. We've got to understand where the position is coming from, and we've got to engage with that empathetically.
Right, yeah. I wish a lot of people who are not in the room would have heard that. So, as the Bristol Free Speech Society, we are focused on, having people who disagree with each other and finding similarities within. But now I'm starting to see, an increasingly pessimistic pictures where people people who I personally used to be friends with cut me off and kind of turn against me just because of some particular issues that we do not agree on. And yeah, do you think this is a increasing trend?
I think it's an increasing trend. And I think that, especially in the context of a university, it's really important to welcome speech that does not threaten violence. In other words, I think it's very important to welcome speech that you think is a bit socially dangerous, that you think is prejudicial and discriminatory, and that you think is in really bad taste. So one of the things that I would say, if you ask, and I'm not attached to a university at the moment, but if you ask me, what is the point of putting through undergraduates through their degrees if they're not going to study further, let's say? If you had to say one thing, what would you say? I would say that the point is to get them out into society with the capacity to engage in conflict constructively. And at the moment, the free speech situation, even in British universities, is not up to standard, because there's a very natural tendency for people to say, if this view is genuinely offensive and potentially socially harmful, in my view, socially harmful, it shouldn't sound out. And I think that's a dreadful mistake. And what we have now got is a generation of undergraduates, and this is worse in the United States than here, but it's bad here too. We've got a generation of undergraduates who are going to be cotton-wooled away from certain kinds of conflict at university that they're then going to be facing with some shock in society, because in society, that's not going to go anywhere. And so this is really, really important. And I think that a consequence of this is that we've got to start thinking about debates about deplatforming and debates about cancel culture in a more serious way, and not confuse ourselves that these are problems that you can only be worried about if you're on the right. People on the left, people on the center, people up and down, and any political vantage point have every reason to worry about restrictions on unlovely speech at the university, in the university system. This is really, really dangerous. Back to the war on Ukraine. If you've got an academic who wants to investigate and talk openly, let's say, about war crimes committed by the side that's the innocent victim in a conflict, that's only committed 0.01% of the war crimes, that person should feel comfortable to go on and do it. And the thing I always say is that views that are socially dangerous need to be challenged, but not silenced when it comes to our universities. So that is something I'm worried about. I'm worried about how far people who were born just after I went to university are in a situation where they're not completely free to say potentially everything they would like and feel comfortable about that. That's no good.
Right. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, I would have wanted to save the discussion about Western universities for a bit later. How much time do we have? Right, but I think let's move back into Russia now that we have mentioned education. So personally, I do think that the tendency, to give in to propaganda kind of comes from education, comes from a very early age. Oh, actually, I should have asked. So what sort of propaganda are people in Russia subjected to? And what made them? Is there any aspect that, for example, in education, is there anything that they lacked that made them susceptible to that sort of propaganda?
The propaganda's got a lot worse since the war, and a great deal more ethically disgraceful because it's increasingly targeting children, including really young children, through the education system, by feeding them fantasies about Putin's greatness and indeed the bogus continuities between Putin's egregious invasion of Ukraine and the Second World War. Broadly speaking, though, the propaganda that the Kremlin generates is a postmodern kind of propaganda that tries to bring it about that citizens are apathetic and give up on politics and remain content to outsource politics to the Kremlin. The propaganda that I experienced in the Soviet Union was different. It was kind of alternate reality propaganda. It was trying to persuade you of a picture of the world that was coherent but not true. The Putin regime doesn't try to persuade you of anything. If anything, it tries to destabilize your faith that anything is true. And it doesn't even set out to persuade you that its own messaging is correct. It tries to persuade you that there is no way to tell who is right, there is no way to tell what's what, and you might as well give up. And that kind of postmodern propaganda has run into trouble for Putin when he has suddenly needed to activate his population a little bit and generate more support for the war and generate more support for mobilization. And so now they are still in that mode of postmodern propaganda, trying to tell people that we can't ever know what's true. But they are now getting worried about whether that propaganda is going to do the job that they need it to do, because they now are trying to balance keeping the population passive, but also to some extent activating them. And over time, they may try to engage a bit more in that Soviet-style propaganda. But I predict it's always going to be less compelling and less successful and easier to see through. But the propaganda that we don't know who is right is very compelling. And back to Russian interference in Western societies, that's a kind of message that is very, very easy to persuade people of, people who are feeling that they are stuck, powerless, disadvantaged, lost, and so on. It's easy to persuade these people perhaps nothing is true and who knows what's really going on. So that's what the Russian propaganda is trying to do. But there is now increasingly an aspect of this matter of trying to bring in some kind of picture and say, no. You know how we said nothing is true? Well, now one thing is true, this sort of glorious historical story about ourselves. Please do take that seriously. But we did tell you that nothing is true just 5 minutes earlier. So and they're trying to work themselves out rather awkwardly here. But I would say that still the majority of the stuff that's being pumped is post-truth stuff. It's the stuff that says politics is epistemically obscure, and you'd better give up on it.
Right. I think I'll ask about the Soviet-style propaganda later, but right now I want to pick up on the postmodernist propaganda. So, as some of us here might be aware, there are places in the world where most people view the war in the complete opposite way of, for example, like in China or a lot of Africa, where people see it as the quote-unquote evil West violating Russia and Russia trying to defend itself. But then, there is a rise in postmodernism amongst young people. Like I can remember myself in school finding this postmodernist idea particularly sexy. And yeah, and so we have a lot of these people in this university, or even quite a few in this room. And so they think that no one thing is truer than another. So they might say that the view of some very pro-Putin individual in China is just as true as the view you and I have, even though that the Chinese individual has been consuming nothing but propaganda. So is this sort of postmodernism in the West something you're concerned about also?
I'm concerned about it. I think that one mechanism in which it comes about is that people start off with a kind of thirst for truth, feeling that they don't want to be duped and tricked. And somehow this desire to not be duped and tricked, which is itself a desire that is completely tied to the idea that there is such a thing as getting the world right, somehow that can lead people to give up on the very idea of truth itself. So a kind of commitment to truth expressed as a desire to not be tricked can then lead to a skepticism about truth itself. And that's a politically real mechanism, I think, and that's a mechanism that really comes alive when there's a crisis of institutional trust. So I'm very, very worried about it. As a philosopher, I think that there are good answers here, but philosophical answers don't solve political crises. And so I don't think that we've got this problem because of philosophical mistakes. This is not Derrida's fault. But I think that talking about relativity of truth is a constructive thing to do and can help us understand a bit better what's going on. I mean, nobody is going to argue, one would hope, that Germany was a country that got invaded in the Second World War and that it didn't invade anybody at all. This is something that is a kind of a blunt fact that's very, very difficult to resist in good faith. But what then happens is that we enter into a terrain of interpretation, where facts and interpretations come together. And here there is a really important role for the universities, because we are struggling with a kind of crisis of interpretation. In other words, we're struggling with taking seriously the idea that things that aren't facts but are interpretations could be true. There are obviously factual claims we can make about the social world, and there are the normative claims we can make about the social world, what should happen. But then there are also interpretive claims. And what's very important is that virtually no serious thinker thinks, there are of course exceptions, that interpretive claims are just relative, that just because something is a matter of interpretation, it's simply a matter of, you know, relativity or a matter of power relations, whatever view you land on. So we've got to revive this business of interpreting the world, of making evaluative judgments about it, without giving up on the idea that these can be true. And because we live in a scientific culture, a culture that tends to say that there are no true answers unless there are scientific true answers, that also, I think, can feed us into this unfortunate dynamic of thinking that once we get beyond things that science can tell us or beyond things that just matters of empirical fact, then nothing is true, really, more than anything else, and each interpretation has equal weight. I think it's really important to resist that. And I've made several claims just in my conversation with you, which are interpretive claims. I've made claims about why Putin started the war. These are not claims that are reducible to matters of fact. I have made claims about what's in Putin's mind to some extent. These are all matters of interpretation about which somebody could disagree with me, but it's profoundly dangerous in the middle of that disagreement for both parties to say, well, you know what? I don't think either view has any chance of being truer than the other.
Right, yeah, so that was relativity about truth. But also now that we're talking about relativity, I just want to pick up on, you know, there's this decolonialism movement that is rather popular in this country and in the West in general. And there also happens to be, a foreign influence narrative that is almost like a cliche narrative in, say, China or Iran, or maybe even Russia, where the governments will go, these Western people are trying to colonize us and take away, like, the Chinese way of life, etc. And yeah, that is kind of reminding me of the decolonization narrative that is increasingly popular, as I just mentioned. And while I would like to believe that the decolonization narrative is well intended, but whenever a totalitarian leader says, well, democracy is a Western construct and authoritarianism is our way of life, like this sort of relativity is the sort that the decolonialists would have to bite the bullet on. And this is actually how a lot of Western people defend, for example, human rights violations in Iran, for example. So do you think that the colonial movement is going to take the West somewhere dangerous?
I think that if you look at narratives of decolonization in Western universities, they're a combination of constructive insight and inclusion, saying, look, these people haven't had a voice. Now they're going to have a voice, and we're going to hear them. I'm going to shut up and we're going to listen. That's important, and there is a lot to that. But at the same time, it's very important that we don't allow ourselves to think that the truth about a certain group is just what that group says about itself. Very often that is the case. We've got to be careful here. And we've also got to be careful about an identity politics that often sits very closely with various kinds of decolonialization discourses that is appalling at bringing about solidarity. In other words, the social justice movements in Western societies today have virtues, but they also have downsides. One of the downsides of some of them, at least, is that they're absolutely awful at solidarity. That is to say, justifying what they are fighting for in terms of how it's important for all citizens, as opposed to just some. And that, of course, comes out very, very significantly if you compare For example, discourse about racial justice from the 60s in the United States and discourse about racial justice today. And what's really, really important here is that worries about identity politics are not worries that should be sort of confined to the right. Just to put my cards on the table and illustrate this point, I believe the United States is a racist society. And I believe that there's a significant degree of racism there that takes the form of deprioritization. That's a view that a lot of folks who scream about identity politics and wokeism would not accept. But nevertheless, I accept that claim and go on to argue, as my colleague Mark Liller, for example, does in the United States, in a book called The Once and Future Liberal that came out a few years ago, that it's very important to understand that projects succeed politically only if they, in the end, have some capacity to appeal to all citizens and not just some. And that's true not just of social justice projects, it's also true of climate projects and climate advocacy. Now, when these sorts of discourses are exploited by the Putin regime, we do, however, have to be careful and acknowledge that the Putin regime is largely exploiting these ideas as political technology. Mr. Putin does not either buy in to any of these ideas, obviously, but he also is not enormously triggered by them either. So when the Putin regime is going on about, getting rid of Western colonial influence, that's made up stuff, and that's political technology that's not really believed in the Kremlin. And also when Putin regime is sounding like Jordan Peterson and is screaming about identity politics, unlike Jordan, Putin isn't really triggered by this. He is using this as a bit of political technology to gain empathy and sympathy from certain demographics in the West. So that's in fact a kind of tactical attempt to get inside our political discourses and make them more toxic. But I think here at home, we've got to be very clear that the big picture for us is to sustain our democracies. And we've got to make sure that enough of our political projects are conducive to that and conducive to the kind of solidarity that requires and conducive to the kind of feeling that is needed, which is that our institutions represent all of us, and not just some of us.
Right, so the lesson we're getting here is that even the same narrative, there are ones that we have to take seriously and there are ones we have to be careful of, and that, first of all, take care of our own democracy.
And think about everybody as being included, including people we struggle to get along with, because these people aren't going to disappear and they're going to keep voting. And some of them might keep voting for anti-democratic options that seek to break the democratic game. And I think that's a very important distinction to look out for when we're looking at politicians across the political spectrum. Is this a political candidate, who is intentionally or unintentionally likely to break the checks and balances and the counter-majoritarian safety nets that keep our institutions going? Or are these politicians that we might just not like for other reasons, but they're not directly parasitic upon the sustenance of democracy? This business of breaking the game is very important. And it's also important that it's not true that if you're of one kind of ideological affiliation, you're going to be out there to break the game. Not at all. You can have somebody who is enormously strongly left-wing and enormously strongly right-wing, who is not out to bring about a situation where the courts stop being independent, whereby governments can't be voted out. So it's very important to pick out this challenge of understanding that it's possible to break this democratic game. It might take more than a year or two to do it, but it's entirely possible. And you've got to watch out for political movements and political projects whose intentional or unintentional impact is going to be to do that, or to get us closer to that happening.
So are there any of them like amongst us that you could name, or is that a bit?
You mean anti-democratic forces?
Yes.
Oh, I think it's very important, of course, to distinguish identifying the problem with debating who is included and who is excluded from the category of the bad guys. And it's also very important that people can be partially good, but partially bad. There could be a politician who's sort of in the middle here. Let's take an example, first of all, of a dynamic, and then we can name some names. So one dynamic that politicians engage in now is not to lie, but to play post-truth. And that's to say, they don't go out and say that A happened when B happened. They go out and say A happened, but B could have happened too. But maybe it was a bit of both. And maybe I'll say A on a Tuesday and B on a Wednesday. And politicians who begin doing that do have this toxic effect. Let's name one politician who in fact had a very constructive role in supporting Ukraine, and that's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. If you look at Boris's messaging on masks across months and months of the pandemic, his messaging wasn't for masks or against masks. His messaging very often was, please wear masks, but I didn't on that occasion because I just didn't feel like it. But maybe I would have done if the circumstances were different. But anyway, I just didn't. I mean, I didn't. Maybe I should have, but maybe I didn't. I just don't love them. I don't love them so much, but please do wear them. What's happening here is much more problematic than deceit. What's happening here is an introduction of a kind of incoherence in speech that makes people give up on the idea that anything is true. That's very different. What Boris is being parasitic upon here is not an issue in pandemic management, which is what to do about masks. He is being parasitic upon people's faith in getting the world right. And so when that's happening, and that might be happening to a politician you admire, you've got to raise your hand and pick out that issue. Somebody who's done that a great deal is Mr. Trump. And you will often find Donald Trump saying opposite things in the course of about 20 seconds. And that's not lying. It's very important to not scream about how certain post-truth politicians lie all the time. Lying is not parasitic upon democracy. Basically, it just isn't. Politicians lie. But what's parasitic upon democracy is this sort of destabilization of the idea that anything is true. So if a politician is asked, is this person a good person or not, it's possible to lie and say that they are when they're not, or that they're not when they are. But what's toxic is to say, some people say they're very good, but others say they're bad. And I thought they were very good, but now I'm having second thoughts. And maybe they are good, but nobody can really know that. And they could be really bad. I mean, that's the sort of Trumpian communication that is parasitic upon truth. And you can have politicians who are doing a lot of good stuff also engaging in this. So it's important to not just put politicians in the good box and in the bad box. It's important to look at different patterns that get us to this outcome where we're at risk of losing our democracy.
Right. Right. So shall we move on to some audience questions? Oh, actually, right, just to the audience, before I forget, if you would like to hear more from Vlad, please check out his YouTube channel, because I'm a big fan and I want to recommend that to like everyone. Sorry, fan moment. Right, so I have got some questions online, and people in the audience, if you would like to prepare your questions. These ones are all from Anonymous. So yeah, this one asks, what common philosophical ideas do different authoritarian regimes have? I think we've covered quite a bit of that, but in case there are anything left out.
A common idea that folks in the Kremlin have, and certainly Mr. Putin has, is that there is no legitimate distinction between opponents and enemies. In other words, we often think of political opposition as a kind of game of cooperation. People play tennis. They're trying to beat each other, but not by any means. And Mr. Putin feels that when we think like that about Western democracies, that's just an illusion. And that underneath, there's just nothing but power dynamics and nothing but people trying to outcompete each other in a way that really can't be explained by these concepts of cooperation as conflict or conflict as cooperation. That is completely unavailable. So there aren't opponents, there are only foes. And if you give up on the idea of political opposition as a coherent political concept, then you're going to give up on the idea of democracy, obviously. So that's one philosophical commitment that I think is sincere, and you're going to find it in the Kremlin.
Yeah, I love how that was actually a distinction that I myself have never thought of. For context, I basically grew up in China till the age of 12 or so, and I think, you know, like despite being out here for almost like close to like 8, 9, 10 years, I think that's thinking kind of still stuck with me. So really, thank you for pointing that out. I have a lesson to learn. Okay, another one. This one. Right, that one's probably already covered. Right. What influence does Russian popular culture, such as 17 Moments of Spring, have on Putin's philosophy?
What were the examples you gave?
Yeah, I don't really know what that is, but 17 Moments of Spring.
But are you talking about more broadly? You're talking about pop music, films?
Yeah, so that is just an online question I got.
Okay, so just repeat that. Just repeat that question. What
Right,
does popular culture have on what?
What influence does Russian popular culture have on Putin's philosophy, if any?
Oh gosh. I think that there are bits of the pop culture that are now simply servicing the regime. And there are bits of the pop culture that are subtly and very indirectly resisting. And there are bits of the pop culture that are staying out of it. As to how they influence Putin, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, Putin enjoys war fiction and gets a lot of his ideas from that. He also enjoys sort of superficially reading some historical texts. He isn't inherently conservative culturally, so he's not somebody who is enormously obsessed about issues of marriage and so on. But I'm struggling to say more. I'm more interested in thinking about how popular culture is responding to Putinism rather than how Putinism responds to popular culture. Putinism certainly likes to exploit popular culture, but I'm sorry, I don't have more to say.
Right, yeah. Okay, the next question. Okay, I'm going to phrase this question in my own way, right? So I think we've been hearing a lot of pessimistic views from political commentators that, as the war goes on, the West or the rest of the world will stop caring about it. Like people will get fatigued, the media will find more eye-catching stuff to report on, and governments will feel less pressured from their people to support Ukraine. And in that sense, time is on Putin's side. So is that true, and is that inevitable? How can we prevent it?
We can't prevent it. We can minimize it, and it is inevitable. But the problem is that for the foreseeable future, American democratic institutions are locked into supporting Ukraine. It's going to be slow for that to change. Skepticism about supporting Ukraine may increase, but it won't be overwhelming. And at the moment, the number of Western citizens who feel not just doubtful of supporting Ukraine, but who feel betrayed by that support, the numbers are high, but they are not really majorities basically anywhere. There's not 50% of the population in any major Western country that feels positively betrayed by this support. So the question is, will this relative fatigue that's inevitable give Putin an opportunity to delay the war sufficiently until maybe there's even more fatigue and loss of interest, so that he can make significant advances in Ukraine? I would say that Putin has a chance of this working out favorably for him, but it's at the moment looking very unlikely. And by favorably, I don't mean that the Putin regime will recover and flourish for years to come. The Putin regime is in a slow death spiral, and that's inevitable. But it's possible that there will be more of a stalemate in Ukraine than we hope. And it's possible that that will go on for a long time. And it's possible that at some point in that process, there will be several politicians in major Western countries who want to take a different perspective on this. But that's not going to happen tomorrow. And the destabilization of the Putin regime and the economic hampering of the Putin regime might actually develop faster than Western fatigue.
Right. So is there anything that we as individuals should do? Actually, I might also like to mention this, that I do think that the 25% of dissidents it's kind of important. It kind of recently occurred to me that whenever we say the word intervention in foreign politics, we mean something like the United States military stationing soldiers in relevant location, which, as we all know, is like a tried and failed method. But the dissidents, the people who know their own country and have the incentive for reform, like above everyone, kind of seem to be neglected. Like we don't really hear so much from them, especially with Russia. How much influence do you think these people are capable of? And is there anything the West could do to help them as well as people in Ukraine?
I think that it's important to connect Ukraine's cause with Russian opposition and Russian dissidents, but not entirely. Ukraine's national interest does not completely overlap with the interest of a Russian oppositional politician who wants to overthrow the Putin regime. Because if you gave Ukraine a magical fence that was placed around its 1991 border, and that came with the promise that the Russians would never come back, Ukrainians would be very happy about this. But that doesn't solve the problem for the Russian opposition who want to get rid of the Putin regime. So in some ways, the interests ally. In some ways, they don't. Now, I think that it's important to encourage the Russian opposition that is now mostly exiled to be more cooperative among itself and quarrel less. And it's also important to give them platforms and support them. But there are limits to this, because in the end, these are people who are trying to work with the population back in Russia. So there's a limit to how far we can help them. But what I think we should do is listen to the best among them when we try to make sense of what the Putin regime is doing and how to understand it and face up to the threat that it's posing to not just Ukraine, but potentially all of us. So they are in a very difficult situation, all Russian opposition, because there will not be a day when they're magically invited to go back into Russia and start a 9-to-5 job, the job of creating a democracy. Not at all. It's going to be a turbulent and unpredictable situation whereby they will try to retain some influence over what happens in Russia from outside. And that is very, very, very difficult to do. Really, really difficult to do. And that's why the small number of people opposed to the regime who are in jail now in Russia are very important as moral authorities. The other thing that's important is a kind of a vision for Russia's future. And we need more of that from the Russian opposition. And we need to keep asking them what their vision is. And some of them are doing better with this, but others still say, unfortunately, banal things like Russia needs to be a normal country like any Western democracy. That's a problem. And so insofar as it's a problem, you could say that Russia is missing, and take this very neutrally, of course, a kind of Lenin. In other words, somebody who is both a political leader, but is also offering a kind of vision of the future that people can buy into. I don't want to endorse Lenin at all, but there is nobody in that role at the moment. Alexei Navalny offers great moral authority and a great commitment to challenging the Putin regime, but it's not completely obvious that he's got a compelling vision for Russia's future that can inspire people to action. So there's a lot of work to do, but it's really hard to do this from overseas. And this is a universal experience. When folks are evicted from highly repressive regimes, it's very hard to have an impact from outside.
Right, I promised the audience I'll move on to audience questions next, but I just want to ask, do you really think that a central figure in an opposition movement is essential? Because to me, so having experienced the 2014 and 2019 Hong Kong protests, the reason I find why the 2019 one lasted so much longer was that the 2014 one was centralized, but the 2019 one was decentralized. So the 2014 one, they arrested the opposition leaders, basically like a bunch of high school and university students, and that movement just ended. Whereas with a decentralized one, that lasted a lot longer. So do you think that there's hope in a sort of decentralized opposition movement without someone like Navalny?
Because of this special problem of depoliticization, I'm skeptical of things moving without coherent leadership. But these situations are hard to predict, and there is just simply no generalizations we can comfortably make about both what works and also about what's going to happen. But the thought about just how depoliticized much the Russian population is, I think, is important. But I suppose, of course, there are ways in which people could be brought into politics with and without political leadership. One way could be if there are just too many Stalinist turns that the Putin regime makes, and they become simply unacceptable to the population. That's more likely, actually, than poverty and economic disadvantage driving people to protest. About that, I'm skeptical.
Right. So are there any audience questions now that we're moving on, Chris? Right, yeah, you might need to come to the mic. I'm sorry.
Yeah, two questions, if you would, and thank you for your presentation. One is
A bit closer. A bit closer to the mic.
Yeah. Okay. One is the role of the Russian Orthodox Church with Putin, and there was a Russian Orthodox Church in Bristol, but because of the Ukrainian conflict, they seceded from the Moscow Patriarchy and moved to Constantinople, which tells you something of itself. And the second question I'd ask is about the ability of differing countries to bring economic pressures to bear on Russia to change its tack without being overly inflammatory and so forth, because, you know, if one gets too provocative, that could have negative results. So I'll leave you to answer those two issues, the church, the economy.
Thank you. There's a degree of pluralism in the church in Russia at the lower levels. The problem is that the upper echelon of the church is simply a government department, and it's a government department with a designated propagandistic job, and it fulfills that job. Its job is slightly different to the job of the fake opposition parties, but it's a job that also has some similarities with what these fake oppositional parties do. So unfortunately, a kind of a cartoonish way of thinking about the church is to see it, sadly, as a government department. In terms of economic pressure on Russia, we've got to be realistic and not conflate isolating Russia by detaching it from the West economically from isolating Russia, period. Russia cannot be entirely isolated. It's simply going to continue having various kinds of relationships with non-Western states. About Western companies, I think there is a good question to ask. What are you still doing in Russia if you're still there? And not everybody has completely got out. So that's a very good question. However, more broadly, this raises the issue of what we can achieve via the sanctions regime. And it's very important to let go of the idea that any kind of economic sanctions on Russia could speed up the collapse of the Putin regime. If anything, sanctions are probably going to play into Putin's hands and help him consolidate his hold over power. That doesn't mean that you should be against sanctions, not at all. Sanctions are necessary, and they're necessary simply because they're inevitable. I mean, what were Western powers going to do if not that? That's the only fundamental tool available. Of course, it was going to be taken. Of course, it had to be taken. The practical effect of the sanctions, I think that matters most, is that they will dramatically slow over time Russia's capacity to wage high-tech war. And that's in itself a welcome and congenial result. I don't personally think, even though the Russians are taking the sanctions as an act of war, I don't personally think the sanctions themselves do anything significant to nuclear risk. Other things we do could affect nuclear risk. I don't think the sanctions do.
Right, thank you. Any other questions? Or Matt? Yeah, you need to. I'm sorry.
Hello, hi. I wanted to ask a bit about Dugin. He was a point called kind of Putin's philosopher, and you do see a lot of kind of overlap in the ideas that Dugin has about civilization and about Putin. But I'm interested if you think he did have much influence, and also if you know anything about their supposed or possible kind of falling out and where he may stand now, if you're familiar with that. Yeah.
Got you. So I have spoken about this a little bit on YouTube, and there's a couple of videos about Dugin. I think that Dugin has essentially zero influence on Putin. Putin does like to quote Ivan Ilyin, who is a more sophisticated thinker than Dugin, who lived much earlier on in the 20th century. But the first thing to say is that Putin is not an intellectual. He's not a systematic reader. So the most he comes up with is to pick a quote from here and there and regurgitate it. The best way to think about Dugin is that he tries to run ahead of the train, if you like. He sees where the train is going. He tries to marginally overtake it, place himself a couple of steps ahead of it, and just run there. There's very little evidence of meaningful contact between Dugin and Putin. And Putin looks with comical derision upon some other figures who are similar to Dugin. And it's logical to conclude that that would be his attitude to Dugin himself. So I think that the idea of Dugin as Putin's brain is radically overestimated. And one of the important philosophical questions here is Dugin offering a set of ideas that are coherent or even available at all, which is this kind of Eurasian proposal for Russia's political identity? And I personally think that there is no there. That in fact, as soon as you begin to seriously ask these questions, you end up returning to various kinds of European cultural resources, which are the sort of thing that Dugin wants to reject. Dugin's own thought takes us back inevitably to all of these bits of European thought, which he leverages as a way of giving up on these very same thoughts. So the problem is that Dugin is using European intellectual resources to get away from European intellectual resources. So I don't think that there's a coherent intellectual project there, but either way, that's not the sort of project that Putin could comprehend or have even empathy for. And in fact, Dugin's reputation in Russia largely depends on the myth of Dugin in the West. So there's a kind of an export of Dugin, and then a return of that export back into Russia. And so his reputation in Russia is to a good extent simply based on the idea that people take him seriously in the West. So that's a very comical kind of dynamic. His influence on Russian culture is not zero. Dugin's influence on Russian culture is not zero. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next few months with Dugin, because there is going to be increasingly a pro-war opposition to Putin, a demographic that says, look, Mr. Putin, we don't want war, we want victory, you're not giving it to us. And it'll be interesting to see if Dugin tries to tie himself to that party and create himself a leadership role there. But he is not somebody who Putin takes terribly seriously, in my judgment.
Right. Which one? Right. So we got this kind of popular question in the polls. Are there any differences in how Russian women and Russian men sees Putin or the war?
The biggest difference is not between genders, but between ages. So there's a huge cultural divide in Russia between generations, to the point that younger Russians are much closer culturally to Ukrainians than to older Russians. And when I say this, I have in mind the fact that Ukrainians are freer than Russians. They're freer of some of the historical traumas. They've processed them better. And they're altogether less politically pathological. So I think that's the key divide. Support for Putin is actually really quite high among the older female demographic, but it's high among the older male demographic too. And so the key differences are going to go by age, not by gender.
Right. So if Putin's regime somehow survives the war and just goes on, and will it be, you know, a sort of positive turn when most of the older generation just, well, I don't want to say it, but die off, and more of the younger generation are within the political sphere?
Putin is trying to preemptively, quote unquote, fascistize the younger generation and children, indeed, who will be the young adults of the future. If he succeeds to some extent, then the picture will be ugly. But if he fails, and that's more likely, then there will be progressively more Russians available for a project that rejects authoritarian imperialism and endorses the modern democratic republic. That doesn't mean it's going to work, but it does mean that increasingly, with this young generation, the next young generation, there will be tens of millions of Russians available for this kind of pro-democratic project that rejects everything that the Putin regime stands for. And Putin knows this. And part of the reasons he's been doing what he's been doing is that he's trying to avert this predicament where the young generation take over and essentially reject everything he stands for.
Right. Another question from the Q&As. Do you think there is any actor who can moderate Putin's war drive?
There are probably 2 or 3 people only who Putin might listen to closely. One of them will be Kovalchuk. Another one of them might be a man called Patrushev, who's an important figure in the regime. I would say that the answer is basically no. Putin is committed to this war, even if he gets evicted all the way out of Ukraine back to the 1991 border, he'll remain completely committed to restarting this war as soon as capacity allows. And I don't see anything changing that, except cessation of biological existence.
Right. We got a question from Thomas. Would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah. Hi, so I have 2 questions. I think both are quite short. So my first question would be, how much influence do regional leaders have in Russia? So I think there was like a governor, I forgot his name, in the Far East some years ago, who like seemed to be some kind of opposition figure and then was put into prison, I think. But I would be generally interested in how influential these kind of regional politicians, governors with some kind of popularity in their own home area have in Russia. And my second question is, because you sounded like that a little bit, would you say that Putin or his advisors are influenced by Carl Schmitt?
Influenced by?
By Carl Schmitt.
Oh, okay. Carl Schmitt. No, because I don't recognize anybody with a capacity for systematic thought there. So they're not even influenced by any kind of Russian versions of Schmitt that we could conceivably name, but they would use quotes from various people, but that's about it. I think it's very apt that you've picked Schmitt out, because I was making this distinction between foes and opponents, but there is no intellectual project of any kind that coherently structures their thought. I just don't believe that's true. In terms of the regions, there's a crisis of the regions in Russia, because the regional infrastructure that to some extent developed and was real under Yeltsin was systematically dismantled by Putin. And standardly now regional leaders are folks who are just sort of flown in and they have little idea of where they are, and then they begin running the place. There is no way for Russia to democratize unless power is returned to the regions. And if federalization is impossible and Russia begins to somehow collapse, then the most benign scenario for collapse, there aren't benign collapse scenarios, but the least catastrophic scenario for collapse is where it roughly happens along the lines of the regional divisions that meaningfully existed in the 1990s and meaningfully had a degree of local power. So this sort of evacuation of power and authority from the regions is something that is inevitably going to have to be returned if Russia is going to even put itself in the position of taking a democratic opportunity that comes its way.
Right, thank you, Vlad. Okay, so I am afraid we are going to have to wrap this up. Thank you, Vlad, so much for your time. And yeah, is there anything you would like, university students like us to know? Or
Sure. I want to say one thing. I said something earlier about the importance of protecting free speech at the universities. Let me say something that was critical. Let me say something positive. Universities generate expertise, and there's something really important to understand about that, whether you're going to be an undergraduate student or a master's student, whether you're going to do a PhD, whether you're going to become an academic. And that's that the kind of expertise that universities generate is the kind of expertise that tethers a society to truthfulness, to its capacity to ask important questions about itself and give those questions truthful answers. Without that, democracy, in my opinion, cannot exist. And so that's why it's very, very important to see these institutions as sacred and to see their expertise as sacred. But one of the consequences of that is we've got to be serious about both insisting on the importance of expertise in the universities, but also being modest about it, because expertise, as it were, often runs aground by traversing too large a space. So it's very important to say about your expertise, if you're going to do research at university, that I know this really well and you'd better listen to me. And if you don't listen to me, you're not even going to have a democracy, on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's also really important for experts to stay reasonably in their lane and not begin talking about 17 different things about which they're not qualified to talk about, and which might lead their central expertise to be, as it were, diluted. So it's very, very important that we get this right by both being humble, but also by being very, very arrogant about what the universities bring to the table, and about the fact that you don't have anything like the kind of political order you want unless the universities are flourishing.
Right, thank you so much. Right, just before we wrap up, I would just like everyone to know we are co-hosting an event with Pinsker Center next month on the 1st of March, which covers more of the Ukraine side of the story. And right, with that said, could we have a round of applause for that, please?
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Vlad. Have a nice evening.
Peaceful night. Bye-bye.